Hi, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. This is I want to respond to the reading and lecture responses that you posted for week 3. I want to begin once again by thanking all of you for your hard work and for doing the readings, for listening to for watching all of the videos and turning in really thoughtful notes. So I want to go over some of the questions you had, some of the comments that you had in preparation for our week 3 discussion forum. So I'll start with the first question, which was by a question by Pan, and Pan said that Pan was confused about the second question about the readings. And so specifically, the confusion was about what I meant by saying that within the context of the emergence of the global economy. So the question that we're referring to here asked, how does displacement occur within the context of the emergence of the global economy? So I'm sorry if the question wasn't clear. Basically, what I was trying to get at is ask, how does displacement, the concept of displacement, which was covered in the readings, how does that occur in today's global economy? So I think when I said within the context of the emergence, that tripped you up. So my apologies for that. That was simply to ask, basically, how does displacement occur today? And so I'll talk a little bit about that because it covers some of the other questions that some of your colleagues had. So let's move on to the question of informalization and displacement. So on informalization, there were 3 questions about it, which I want to address. So the first question was by Anna. Anna asks, what is the difference between informalization and casualization? Are they similar ideas? Great question, Anna. And I'm gonna read the other 2 questions and then try to answer them together. Jade asks, well, how does informalization lead to slums in developing countries? So that's also an important question. And Paloma asks, after reading the text, I found most of the topics easy to understand, but if you could put informalization into a simpler definition, it would be nice. Although the book has an in-depth definition, it is also a little too complicated to understand. So let's kind of talk through what informalization is. And as a part of that, I will also talk about displacement. Nicole had a question about how displacement could be solved. So we'll get into that. But let me talk about displacement and its relationship to informalization as a way to address some of these questions. Dislocation and displacement. And here, the simplest way to think about it is when people are forced to move from where they were before. So it's basically forced removal in some ways. So for me, there are two ways in which we see displacement occur. Sometimes these are politically motivated, and so a classic example of this is wars or civil wars that occur. So these are political displacement that occurs for political reasons. The other type of displacement that occurs, which is the one that we were talking about or reading about this week or last week, was economic displacement. And this occurs as a result of changing terrain of the economy. So, for example, we'll talk a little bit about some of that, but it could be your economic activity was you were involved in one type of economic activity. That type of economic activity is no longer available to you for different reasons, and thus you become displaced from that job that you had. Now, if you're within the context of as we will see, or as we saw in the readings, that you get displaced out of that job, but then there are no other jobs that are able to replace the job that you left, you become displaced. And so that now you have to think about moving or migrating for economic reasons. And so we see that actually happening across the world today. We see migration occurring, two types of migration occurring. One is migration from rural areas to urban areas. This was the case, for example, in China and in India. We see a move from the rural areas to urban areas. And the other is movement from capital poor areas to capital rich areas, meaning you move from places that don't have a lot of money to places that have a lot of money. So, there's a general sense in the United States that everybody's trying to come to the United States, which is partially true. But if you look at the map of the world, what is happening is people are going from places that are poor to places that are richer. So, for example, places like South Africa, places like the Persian Gulf, so countries like Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. These are all places in which you see people moving there, attempting to go there, or South Africa, or other places. So in different parts of the world, you see these capital-rich areas that attract people that are displaced from their previous economic activity, looking for new ways to substitute for that economic activity. So that's what displacement and dislocation is. So how do we put this within a larger context? So one of the things that if you look at the history of capitalism is the predominant way of organizing economic and political life in the world today. So under capitalism, when capitalism starts, from its inception, it displaced people. So one of the things that happens in capitalism, in the start of capitalism, and capitalism as an economic political system starts in England and in France. When it starts, a process also occurs called the enclosures. You see this specifically if you look at British history. And the enclosures was the process of land being privatized and kicking out older peasants or serfs that used to be in land, and that land then became privatized, then owned by certain people. And so that is one of the earliest iterations, one of the earliest examples of people being displaced from their previous vocation, namely being farmers, and because the land that they were on became owned and privatized by new kind of new merchants and new landlords that were emerging historically at that period. I'm talking about the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so then you had these former folks who were formerly involved in food production that now had no land, and then they had to basically they were moving from place to place looking for jobs. So capitalism always had a process of, or it often dislocated and displaced people. Now, from a capitalist perspective, what you get, the defense of this is sometimes called, the defense of this is to say that, well, look, capitalism changes constantly the economic activities. It's innovating and developing different economic activities. And so that sometimes creates, it destroys certain economic activities as it builds new ones. So yes, some people might no longer have jobs, but then there are new jobs that are being created, and so they shift from those old jobs to the new jobs. That's how people would kind of defend it. So one of the terms that is often used is the term you call a phrase called creative destruction. It was coined by Joseph Schumpeter. He's a scholar that I think was mentioned very briefly in the sociological imagination piece that we read. And creative destruction, what Schumpeter was talking about was to say that, look, I'm now putting some words into his mouth, but to kind of put it in my own words, that creative destruction happens in capitalism as new types of industrial activity is produced, new types of businesses emerge, and when these new businesses emerge, sometimes they destroy the older ways of doing things. So they destroy old models, and so old models are destroyed in this creative drive to produce new models of profit making, new models of business. And so this is called creative destruction. And he's like, and sure, then within that creative destruction, the destruction part of it might displace and dislocate people. So think about something like, and this is maybe not the perfect example, but something like Netflix emerging, and right as Netflix is emerging, older businesses like the video rental business, like Blockbuster, for example, go out of business, right? So this is like creative destruction. Netflix comes in and has a brand new way of selling you content, and the older way of selling you content, namely like renting out video, VHS or DVDs or whatever, just kind of goes out of the way because streaming now is coming out. So all those people that were invested and worked under Blockbuster all go out of business. But now the idea is, well, you have something new coming in the form of Netflix or something. So to put it in other words, what I'm trying to say is that displacement and displacement from economic activity, we've seen this historically off and on throughout the development and the movement of capitalism, and some have celebrated that, like Joseph Schumpeter, as he talks about the notion of creative destruction. So to understand then what is going on today, we have to understand a big change that happens as a result of neoliberalism. And this big change happens in the move from the nation state parameters, moving to a much more transnational kind of organization of the economy. So what we used to have before, was nation states were able to set the rules in terms of what corporations have to do, what workers' rights there were, what environmental regulations there were. All these things were set up by governments. And most economic activity in the world occurred within the borders of these different governments. So, the economic activity occurred within the United States or within Canada or within Mexico. And so when all of that economic activity occurred within the United States, Canada, or Mexico, let's say, the governments in the United States, Canada, and Mexico could then regulate what is happening to the or what the corporations in their countries are doing. What happens though after neoliberalism? And here the before and after, the magic moment that we're talking about, the magic decade, is the 1970s. So after 1970s, what occurs as a result of neoliberalism is a weakening of borders for capital and commodities. Capital is another term for money and commodities. So borders and border regulations for money and goods were weakened, meaning that now corporations were able to move their operations all across the world, right? They could move across different borders. People can't, so their workers can't, but the corporations can move as a result of that. So what that means is, if you set up a regulatory framework, right? If you said, everybody in my country X, all employers should pay a minimum wage of whatever, $10 an hour. And if I'm a corporation in country X and I don't like the regulation that said I have to pay my workers $10 an hour, because of the weakening of borders, what I could do is say, okay, well, what if I don't, instead of making my factory in your country X, where I have to pay workers $10, I'll just move it somewhere else. So I'll move my factory somewhere else where I could pay my workers cheaper. Because in country Y, for example, they don't have a minimum wage law. So I could pay them a lot cheaper there. So as a result of the policies that happened in the 1970s, as a result of neoliberalism, and the policies that weakened the borders for capital and commodities, what this allowed to happen is for corporations to move around the world looking for reduced labor and overhead costs. And so reducing labor and overhead costs means you are looking for places that lack regulatory frameworks or lack strong regulatory frameworks. So as a result of this, two things happen, two interconnected things. On the one hand, in industrialized countries, you get deindustrialization, meaning that industries leave those countries. And then in countries that were not industrialized, you start to have industrialization. Meaning that these industries that leave these countries, they move to these countries that were not industrialized. So what is occurring here is that good jobs leave. So good jobs leave places like the United States, for example. By good jobs, I mean jobs that are permanent, they pay well, and they have benefits. These are good jobs. And those jobs they end up leaving. And this becomes the places that are deindustrialized. And then where do they go? Those jobs go to here. But here, when they get here, these good jobs become bad jobs by the time they arrive to these newly industrializing countries. How do they become bad jobs? They are not permanent. They lack protections. They don't pay as well. And they don't have benefits. Right? Because that's the reason why those corporations deindustrialize, they move their factories from one country to the other, is specifically to look for cheaper wages, cheaper regulatory, cheaper environmental costs, cheaper overhead. And so they're moving to, by the time they move the work that they, by the time they move the work, they're moving it from places where they had to pay a lot of money or they had to pay more as a result of the regulations that those countries have to other places that don't have them. Just as a further example, in the United States, actually, we are seeing the industrialization happening within the country. So what you're getting is states that before used to have good laws around good work conditions, wages, and benefits. The companies are leaving those states and they're going to states where there is no laws protecting for wages or pay or good benefits, or states that have laws against unionization. So you're seeing the industrialization occurring in the United States. So in places like what is called the Rust Belt, think Ohio, Michigan, those places used to have regulatory frameworks that were strong. Now corporations, factories have left there, and where do they go to set up shop? They set up shop a lot of times in the South, where there are no legislations to protect workers, and in fact there's legislation on the opposite end to make sure that workers don't unionize, for example, or don't ask for or to reduce the legal mechanisms by which workers could seek aid or seek more pay from employers. So as a result of neoliberalism and the weakening of borders, we get this thing about deindustrialization in developed countries and industrialization in developing countries. This process, this deindustrialization, this of course displaces many people, right? All those people that used to have good paying jobs now no longer have those jobs anymore because those factories have shut down. And here, when those jobs are moved to somewhere else, so like say they move to Mexico, they now hire people that were displaced from their other jobs. So here, for example, in Mexico, what happens is a lot of folks that used to be agricultural workers, for different reasons, those agricultural workers, the agriculture is being undermined for different reasons that we could get into. And so those people have left their farms and they're looking for new jobs. And so where do they find these new jobs? They find these new jobs in these low-paid factory work, usually in the north, close to the border within the United States. So you're seeing displacement occur both in the places that deindustrialization happens and in places that industrialization is happening. Now, many of you asked about casualization. And casualization, this is part of what occurs as a result of neoliberalism. And casualization is basically it's talking about the process of creating more casual jobs. And by casual jobs, we don't mean jobs that are kind of chill and you get to hang out at. Casual jobs are jobs that are not permanent. These are temporary jobs. They could be seasonal jobs. These are jobs that you cannot necessarily bank on them being here for a very long time. So the process of casualization is a process by which by which we produce jobs that are temporary, not permanent, might be seasonal in the case of agricultural work. And so you are these are jobs that are not as good as permanent jobs, right? Because if you have a temporary gig, you can't build a life around it because you don't know if this job is going to be here a year from now, or you don't know if you're going to have 30 hours a week that you could count on. Maybe next week is only 10 hours. The week after that is 20. There's a lot of volatility in that. So casualization is the process of creating these more casual jobs or temporary jobs. So for me, the way I think about it is temporary jobs as opposed to permanent jobs. That's what casualization is. Now, this process, these create pressures in which many folks enter into the informal economy. So then the question is, well, what is informal versus formal? The formal economy is the basically economic activity that is regulated by law. And so, for example, one way to think about it is the formal economy are jobs that, for example, the government taxes or could tax, or that is jobs that are recognized by the marketplace, as these are kind of the jobs that exist in the economy. The informal economy is economic activity that is in many ways outside the legal framework. These are also jobs that are, or economic activity that is not taxed or recognized by governments. And so the informal economy grows or gets bigger when the formal economy cannot contain or doesn't have a lot of room for those jobs, and that's also based on sometimes definitions too, in terms of what you define as formal to informal economy. So let me give you some examples. So a formal economy is everything that you get, a paycheck for. Everything that is, again, that is governed by kind of the legal framework. Informal economy runs the gamut, so it could be anything from the way that we usually think about it, or the example that's usually thought of when we talk about the informal economies. For example, the drug trade, right? The selling and buying of illegal materials like drugs. That is part of the informal economy. Why? Because that is illegal, right? It's illegal economic activity, thus it's informal. Another type of informal economy could be sex work in places in which sex work is illegal. That becomes part of the informal economy. But informal economy could also be somebody having a food stand. Or a paletero, right? Somebody selling ice cream in the park, in an ice cream truck selling ice cream. That is part of the informal economy. Somebody selling food that they make out of their house. That is informal economy. So somebody selling T-shirts on the side of the road. That's also considered the informal economy. So these are all parts of the informal economy. Day workers, day laborers. If you go to Home Depot, a lot of times now it happens less because a lot of workers have organized themselves into cooperatives. But sometimes you have just workers waiting outside of Home Depot looking for any type of kind of manual labor that people would hire them. At that point, that's part of the informal economy. So that's the split between the formal and the informal. The problem, of course, with the informal economy is there is a lot more risk involved, and those happen to also be jobs that might either be riskier or do not pay that well. And in many places, the rise in the informal sector occurs because the formal sector cannot absorb people coming in. So, for example, people that are displaced from rural areas, when they move to the urban areas, it's not always guaranteed that just because they got displaced out of their former work, that there is a new job waiting for them if they move to the cities. In fact, most of that labor force that comes from the agricultural sector, let's say in the rural areas, to the urban areas. In the urban areas, there's not a lot of jobs to absorb all of that. And so then what are those folks to do? They're forced into the informal sector. So they find some kind of job to do, some kind of way to make a living. And it could be that those jobs could be more informal. And as that happens, what you also end up seeing is people start to live in more informal housing. So what is informal housing? Informal housing is temporary shelters or housing that is not permitted, for example, or something even as couch surfing. That is informal housing, as opposed to formal housing where you have an apartment that's permitted by the city or the state or the government that you live in. Informal housing, this is where there was a question about slums. Slums develop in places where people need to live somewhere, but there's not inadequate housing for them. So then they just create shelters that they could live in. So if, in Los Angeles, for example, if you're driving by freeways or sometimes parks, you see a lot of informal housing, people creating tent cities where folks live in those tents because of the economic conditions that they find themselves in, because of a lack of housing. So they create informal housing, and those folks might also most likely be involved in informal work as well. So this, in the category of informal, is a very broad category that encapsulates everything that isn't part of the formal economy. But it could run the gamut from, again, something as illicit as the drug trade to something that is, not illicit, or it's not necessarily bad. Folks selling food, doing all kinds of different labor work, domestic workers, nannies. Those are all jobs that could be part of the informal economy and are part of the informal economy. So this is kind of how you see kind of the move from the changes because of neoliberalism to deindustrialization to informalization and casualization, right? So casualization takes away your permanent jobs, gives you a temp job. Also, what could happen to you is, as those jobs in the formal economy leave because of deindustrialization, or leave because those factories or those jobs are moving somewhere that pay cheaper, now you're forced out of the formal economy into the informal economy. So you go from working in a factory to selling food in a food stand, or from a factory, for example, to working in someone's house, doing different types of kind of jobs for them that is outside of the formal sector. So I hope that is somewhat helpful in terms of the conversation around the informalization. So when Jade asks, how does informalization lead to slums in developing countries? The question here is not that one causes the other. It's not that informalization will lead to slums, but rather the other processes that are causing informalization also will cause the creation of slums. So one of the reasons that happens, for example, is this movement from the rural areas to urban areas, in which the jobs that used to be in rural areas no longer exist, but there is not new jobs in urban areas that could absorb those folks that have moved from the rural areas. And so when that doesn't exist and people cannot make money in order to buy or rent regular homes, now they have to create informal shelters. Shelters many times become these slums. Now, let's move on to a question by Michael Reyes. Michael asks, when the book was talking about displacement, they gave an example of agricultural yields in poor countries. I really did not understand the example. Can you please elaborate on it and go over it again? Michael, I had a hard time finding where you were talking about specifically about the agricultural yields. So maybe if you could be more specific, I'll try to respond to you. But let me just point out some important things here. The question about agriculture is an important one for one main reason, and that is agriculture is what's called a labor-intensive economic activity. Labor-intensive meaning it takes a lot of people to work. Sometimes some things are labor-intensive, some things could be capital-intensive. So, for example, if you are drilling for oil, right, the oil sector is capital intensive, meaning you need to have a lot of money to be able to get the tools, the machinery to dig up oil. It requires a lot of money, but it's not labor intensive. The amount of workers that you need is not as much. There's other gigs, though, such as agriculture, that is labor intensive. It requires a lot of workers. So this is important when when the nature of agriculture changes. The consequence could be the displacement of many, many, many people. Because there's a lot of people that work in the agricultural setting. And so here in the example in the book, they were talking about in many countries, what you had is a move from small plots of land that people had, in which they produced different agricultural products that were consumed locally, but within that country, for example. And we've moved to agribusinesses, in which you produce a smaller amount of crops, because you're not necessarily selling to your local market, but you're selling to the global market. And as a result of that, you undermine, or you don't need as much labor, because with the agribusinesses you also get technological advancement too, and so you just don't need as much labor. All of that labor now that is shed in the rural areas has to go somewhere else. So in the case of, for example, Mexico, in Mexico you had farmers in the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico. After 1994, because of the agreement called the North American Free Trade Agreement, two things happened, or farming became a lot less viable, because the land of many farmers were being bought up by larger agribusinesses, and also because the products that those farmers used to produce, the prices were cheapened because of cheap imports of American farm products. And so then those farmers in the state of Chiapas now had to leave. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to two different places. All of them moved north. Some moved north to the border, where they're going to pick up jobs in this newly industrial activity that was coming down from the United States, right? So the industries, the factories that left different parts of the U.S. and left Americans unemployed, now we're going to Mexico, where these farmers that were now displaced from the south of Mexico moved up to those new factories. Now, those new factories that they moved to, of course, were not, they didn't pay as much. So it left a lot of those workers forced to engage in the informal economy at the same time, because their jobs in the formal economy did not pay them as much. The job at the factory wasn't paying them as much, so they needed to do other things. So they were also involved in the informal sector. So that was one set of farmers that moved from Chiapas to these new jobs. The other set of farmers that left Chiapas and who moved up north moved to the United States. And in the United States, they also then joined the ranks of informal workers or casual workers. So a lot of them, for example, when I was studying at UC Santa Barbara, a lot of the farm workers that you would see working in places like Oxnard and Ventura, when you drive from LA to Santa Barbara, a lot of them were coming from Chiapas, for example. There was a large number of farm workers from Chiapas that have moved there. And so they were displaced from Chiapas. By the time they get to the United States, they either become seasonal casual labor, or they become informalized in the United States. So you see this kind of chain effect as you displace farmers where now they're looking for other things to do. So agriculture, when you're looking at development, agriculture is actually really important, not only because it produces food and creates sustainable kind of food production, so you don't have to, for example, import food from outside or something, but also it employs a lot of people. And so if you do not invest in agriculture, you end up having to deal with what are you going to do with new workers coming into urban areas that cannot necessarily absorb them, for example. So Nicole then asks, is there a way that we can fix displacement that goes on? It is really disheartening for people to lose their jobs, especially when they are already usually people who work for minimum wage or even less than that in countries with lower standards of living. It's an important question, Nicole. And so, we'll go into some of the ways that maybe we could resolve these issues. But there's two things I want to point out here. One is that the question of displacement is a systemic issue. Like I said, with capitalism, you'll always have this problem of constant displacement of people. And so that is something that happens structurally in some ways. And then the other thing to point out is that, especially now, some of the jobs that people are being displaced from aren't actually minimum wage jobs. So there's a lot of jobs that used to be not minimum wage jobs that people are displaced out of, like good so-called middle class jobs. So this doesn't just impact the lower ranks or the lower classes, but also now a lot of middle classes too, as the nature of the economy shifts and as wages stagnate, as wages don't go up year over year, and companies are looking to reduce wages, and governments are not interested in creating regulatory frameworks to help ensure that wages stay the same or go up. What that does is it creates the drive to further displace people or create more casualization. Okay, and so I hope this answered also the question by Anna when she asked about informalization versus casualization. So again, casualization is temporary as opposed to permanent work, whereas informalization has to do with, are you part of the formal economy or part of the informal economy? So let's go to our last four questions, which were about questions generally about ways of resolving labor, some of these labor issues that we've been talking about. So Jacob asks, one of the questions was, what are some solutions to fixing this problem of companies being able to outsource their production to other countries where they can find cheap labor? Is there a way to work with those countries and laborers to find a way to give them better conditions, pay, and hours while still maintaining their jobs for the company? Ultimately, the question is there a better way to go about this outsourcing of labor to those countries where cheap labor is being produced? This is a good question, Jacob. So we could think of maybe different strategies, different policies, but at the core, what the issue is this move from an economy that was structured around or contained within the nation state to an economy that is global. In other words, the big issue here is allowing capital, money, and commodities, goods, to be able to move around the world without really any borders to speak of. The weakening of borders, allowing capital and commodities to move around the world at the same time that those borders exist for people, that is the central one of the central structural issues, because it's that very lack of border regulations that allows companies to move across the world looking for the cheapest labor. And what those companies are taking advantage of is the fact that, globally speaking, there isn't a regulatory framework that advocates or defends workers or the environment. The regulatory framework that does exist, if you look at, for example, the World Trade Organization, is a regulatory framework that protects the rights of businesses. For example, patents and copyrights. These are the rights that are important for business. Those things, those are what's protected by kind of these more global regulatory mechanisms. And I say that at the same time as we should note that those global regulatory frameworks, even for those things, aren't as strong as they could be, or they aren't as strong as regulatory frameworks are within the borders of a country. So we have a hard time, because at the same time that our economy since the 1970s, by our I mean the entire world's economy, has globalized and become much more global, the rules that we have are still based on a framework of nation states, are based on the framework of each country. So our rules haven't caught up with where the economy is, right? Like to put it another way, the economy has moved faster than politics. The economy is global. Politics is still country by country specific. So this is what creates then the problem of then companies moving from one place to the other, looking for a bargain. And so that becomes one of the problems, I think, that you're dealing with. Is there a way to solve this? Yes, there is, and that is one of the ways to do this is regulatory frameworks, or having countries come together to develop rules that they all abide by. I'll give you one example that just happened. There was the meeting of the G7. The G7 are the group of 7 rich nations across the world. And these guys, they're not, it's actually, that excludes China and excludes Russia and others. But it's a very influential group. This influential group came together. Their meeting was just had, actually. This was why President Biden was traveling abroad in England. And one of the big things that happened as a result of G7 was an agreement to set a global minimum tax rate for corporations. And what they were trying to respond to is the fact that corporations were moving their monies around the world looking for places where they don't have to pay a lot of taxes. And so companies were able to create a bunch of create all kinds of mechanisms to elude taxation. And so what you're seeing is this move on the part of the U.S. and the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and others to make sure that all of these G7 countries, at least, they're all going to have a minimum tax rate and to make it harder for companies to be able to move across and evade taxes of one country versus the other. So I bring that example up to suggest that this is an example of a way to deal with this. So the tax evasion was a problem. They came together to create some kind of a more global or more transnational regulatory framework. Transnational meaning above or beyond the nations or national boundaries. So can that also be done for labor? Why not, right? This is, again, your politics has to catch up to where the economy is. So Tandi asks, if informal markets lead to exploitation, what would be a solution for an income in semi-peripheral countries? Well, Tandi, it's a great question. So how do you deal with informalization? So one of the ways you deal with informalization is to make it into the formal economy. So there's a lot of ways in which you could make an informal economic activity into a formal economic activity. So, for example, taco trucks in Los Angeles, or food trucks in Los Angeles. There used to be a lot, there still is a lot of food trucks in LA, but for a while, those food trucks in many ways were considered part of the informal economy because there was no regulations on them. And so what the government could do is could turn that into the formal economy by saying, you know what, we see that there are food trucks. We're going to set up some guidelines, some health and safety guidelines for the food trucks. And in return, we're going to protect them as well from different kinds of issues and problems that might come up. For example, workers not getting paid or harassment or things like that. So you could change the informal economy into the formal economy, and the government could come in and kind of help that process. But what that means, Tandi, though, is investment on the part of the government into this process. It means an expansion of the government's capacity. The government has to become a little bit stronger so that it could intervene in these kinds of things that it before wouldn't intervene in. And when we're talking about semi-peripheral or peripheral countries, this is very important because those informal economic sectors, if they're formalized, you could increase their people's wages. You could provide some safety and benefits for them. And when you're doing that, then you're also that means you're having to manage a lot of the services that aren't provided to those informal workers, such as health, housing, and some of those basic services. So that requires, again, an investment on the part of the government. And this has happened previously in peripheral, semi-peripheral countries, and it still happens today. In fact, you might have read about ISI, or import substitution industrialization. That was one mechanism by which a lot of the anti-colonial governments that came in to power in the 50s, 60s attempted to invest in the very kind of informal sectors of society and the economy. So the next question is Jure. Jure also asks a similar question. What could be a solution to these problems? Could more governmental regulations or a united global regulatory system aid the individuals being exploited? Yeah, definitely, right? And again, it's not an easy way, because when you're talking about regulations that involve more than one country, that automatically becomes more complicated. But it could be done. We are living in a condition in a context in which our regulatory frameworks, globally at least, benefit corporations and owners of corporations much more than workers, for all kinds of historical reasons. But that's kind of where we are. So the regulations that do exist for and on behalf of corporations, much more than they do on behalf of workers. And so you make an argument for, well, we should balance this out more? Yeah, you could. And maybe you should, right? So that is definitely one way of dealing with this. And there's a lot of scholars who have pushed for this as well. And this isn't a case of, if you are anti-capitalist or capitalist. People who are capitalist have also suggested this, right? So one of the meaning that this need not be a revolutionary thing. Revolution meaning we have to change the entire system. But there are reformist agendas as well talking about government regulations. So one big thing that folks have talked about is creating a global welfare system. This was even being talked about in the World Economic Forum, which is a gathering of all major kind of business and political leaders, where they were talking about we need to make sure there's a lot of our economy is producing a lot of poverty, a lot of poor people. We need to be able to make sure that that doesn't happen, because if there's a lot of poverty, that creates turmoil within the system. Meaning even the elites, the economic elites of this system, are thinking also along are thinking about this question of how do we, maybe our regulatory frameworks aren't really helping a lot of workers, and if we don't do just a little bit of that, if we don't kind of create more balance in the system, this might be problematic for the system in general. So I think you're right in many ways, Jure. And so let's end with the last question about the readings is from Ismail. Ismail asks, if we are to proceed with globalization on a grander scale, shouldn't we be doing something about all the various places where informalization is being practiced? Based on previous knowledge, I know that most of the products we have in life were produced in areas where informalization is practiced very often. What is something we could do to, as a whole, to fix this? As always, really great open-ended question, Ismail. And I think we kind of touched on this. Globalization is on a grand scale already. So we are where you are talking about. And the thing is, so the one amendment I would say to your question, because you say, shouldn't we be doing something about all the various places where informalization is being practiced? So informalization isn't a practice necessarily, but it's an outcome of various different things that are happening. Do you know what I mean? In other words, it's not that like some planners, city planners, or economic policymakers sat together and say, you know what, let's do 30% informalization here. So rather, it's the type of policies that you set in place produce the conditions for the increase in the informal sector, right? It's an outcome of policies as opposed to the intention of policies. No policymaker is going to go out and be like, you know what, I'm for informalization. Let's practice informalization. Even if their policies create informalization, they're not going to say that because it's not necessarily a good thing in many ways. Okay, so these were all the reading responses. Please respond to what I'm saying, or respond to one of your colleagues who've asked some great questions. Some, what Jacob, Tandi, Jure, and Ismail asked were all great questions. I would actually add also Nicole's question to this. So these were open-ended questions. I've responded in my based on my thoughts, but feel free to respond to me, respond to them, and I look forward to hearing your responses to them. Thank you.